Again, we know how extreme Duffield's transphobia is in how cis women, being paid a full salary, couldn't even bring themselves to be around it. She's lying about the class differences at play here to try and paint herself as sticking up for the underdog. And it's fucking patronizing to see her try to sell the line that transphobia is a feature of the working class. Before we can begin, I just need to give a content warning for the following topics: transphobia, homophobia, racism, misogyny, doxing, harassment, suicide, domestic abuse, and sexual violence. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media like Twitter and Discord. So we've covered Rosie Duffield on this channel before, specifically the way in which her hatred towards trans folk led multiple cis women, so not even people who experienced transphobia firsthand, to leave Duffield's office due to it creating a hostile work environment. One of those women, a cis lesbian who was Duffield's sole LGBT+ staff member at the time, went on to tell Pink News that, quote, "I cannot put a price on my self-respect or my commitment to LGBT+ rights," end quote. The story only worsened from there. For you see, two of these women, the lesbian I just quoted and a second cis woman, approached Pink News under the promise of anonymity. There is a real fear of the sort of violence that has come to define the gender-critical ideology over the past decade, with it having a long and sordid history of doxing and harassing people, including cis women, for not submitting to their spiteful will. These women, who remember had personal experience with the way Duffield treats those who don't accept her bigotry, were afraid of what might happen to them should their names be made public. Sadly, they were proven right. Duffield wasn't about to let her victims escape without a further twist of the knife, and promptly outed at least one of her former employees, opening them up to the very abuse they'd been so terrified of in the first place. This is a vital fact to bring up any time Rosie Duffield targets trans people. Why? Well, just watch the way Duffield frames herself in the clip I'm about to show you, taken from her recent appearance on the BBC show Politics Live. I'll be playing a couple minutes from the discussion to provide you with the relevant context before we discuss what was said. To see the full discussion, check the numbered references that can be found in the video transcript, linked down below. So with that said, let's check it out.
Do you understand why transgender people and groups who feel excluded from that definition have become upset about it?
To a certain degree, but women and women's safe spaces are my main concern. And trans groups have plenty of representation, rightly so, and they do talk about these things, but I don't want the rights of women to be in conflict with the rights of trans people.
I mean, Ellie, these are views expressed by Rosie that are held by many in society, and yet they seem to be unacceptable to express, certainly in some forum. Why?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the majority of women actually do support transgender rights, and they do say that, you know, a trans woman is a woman. So actually, it may be held by some in society, but it's not the majority view, and it's not the majority view of women. So I think that's the first thing to say.
But what about the definition of woman as by your biological sex rather than your preferred gender identity?
You know, I actually don't know why some people are women and why some people are men. No one on this panel does. And anyone who claims to know the answer to that question is a liar. All I care about is the principle of live and let live and showing one another respect. So if a person says, yes, I was born a man, but I am a woman, and this is how I live my life, I want to respect that person for who they are, because I don't think they're doing anything wrong, and they're certainly not bothering me in any way. So I think the ultimate important principle here that we should all share if we want a free and accepting society is live and let live.
And is that...
That's absolutely great, and I totally agree with that in principle. But if you are a woman who has been abused all of your life and ended up in prison, you may not feel quite that liberal towards someone in a male body who is then allowed onto your wing of the prison. You may have had a lifetime of abuse and rape, which has been done to you by a man in a male body, and when they're just calling themselves a woman, you may feel very differently about being in a hospital ward with them or a prison wing. And I think that those women, it's usually working class women who haven't necessarily had the best start in life or the best experience, that are really worried about this, and the ones that are having to deal with it rather than politicians. And my job is to protect those women that don't have a voice in Parliament like I do.
Do you accept that?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to say again that the majority of women actually agree with me on this issue.
Well,
so I think that's the first. Let
fine,
me finish the
but
question.
no, I do. But I want you to respond directly to what.
On lots and lots of
my
lots of
constituents.
polling, lots of national polling that asks a range of questions about.
You're talking
the
about
issue.
self-ID particularly?
No, I'm talking about the broad principles of supporting people's rights to change gender, which
Well,
they're legally allowed
so
to do.
do I.
So let me finish my point. So I think, we've seen in other issues like abortion, for example, where people who are opposed often use the most extreme cases to argue against, in principle, what are positions that we can all agree with, which is people should be respected for who they are. And actually, when we're saying that a small group of people should not be allowed to live as they are because other people might be upset about it, well, that is the very essence of discrimination. And I don't think that most of your viewers watching this would support that.
So there's a number of things to unpack here. The first of which is the fact that, in spite of claiming to want impartiality when it comes to discussion on the rights of trans people, both guests talking about the issue are cis women. The BBC's idea of impartiality is denying trans people, in this case specifically trans women and trans femme folk, a platform to talk about their rights. This is done both directly by not inviting them, as well as indirectly by pitting them up against extremely transphobic voices like Rosie Duffield. I mean, she has just misgendered every trans woman throughout the UK in declaring them male-bodied. Trans women are female. Their bodies are the bodies of women, a fact agreed upon in science. To give a number of leading institutions that share this consensus, we have the Endocrine Society, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, the American Society of Andrology, the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology, the European Society of Endocrinology, the Pediatric Endocrine Society, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. What Duffield is doing here is trying to exploit the veneer of science by using technical sounding terminology to cover for the fact that she's calling trans women men in a roundabout manner. It's part of an attempt to appear civil to a larger audience while simultaneously trying to hurt trans women by steadily eroding away their humanity as women and through that their human rights. Again, we know how extreme Duffield's transphobia is in how cis women, being paid a full salary, couldn't even bring themselves to be around it. So how can anybody reasonably expect a trans woman to expose herself to that in order to beg for her rights? They can't. And setting Duffield and similar transphobes' participation as a condition for trans people to sit at the table is a means of indirect exclusion. There are conversations to be had, and there are people we are willing to have them with. It's just that people who deny our basic humanity, like Miss Duffield does, are not among them. The truth is, the BBC simply sees impartiality as a word to cover for the now constant attacks on trans folk and the larger LGBT+ community, including leading LGBT+ advocacy group Stonewall. This is just the latest in a growing pile. We also have Duffield's repeated claims to want to protect women who don't have a voice in Parliament, like she does. This leads me to wonder where that desire to protect vanished when she decided it would be fitting to dox a former female employee, putting her at risk of actual violence. Of course, the truth is, Duffield doesn't care about women in the slightest, at least not those outside of her rich white inner circle. She merely exploits the narrative of rape and abuse, hijacking it as a means of framing trans women and trans femme folk as violent monsters. This is certainly why the far right, the creators of this myth, came up with it in the first place. As described in the own words of US hate group Mass Resistance, quote, "Our side concocted the bathroom safety male predator argument as a way to avoid an uncomfortable battle over LGBT ideology, and still fire up people's emotions. It worked in Houston a few years ago, but the LGBT lobby has now figured out how to beat it. Their lopsided victory in Massachusetts will likely be repeated everywhere else unless the establishment pro-family groups and their wealthy donors are willing to change their tactics." End quote. Sadly, many, including Duffield, continue to cling to this tactic, implying that every trans woman is a sexual predator in waiting. This is in spite of the fact that trans people are far more likely to be the victim of sexual violence than the perpetrator, with 47% of trans folk having experienced sexual violence. The only LGBT+ group with higher rates? Bisexual women at 61%. But Duffield refuses to acknowledge this and similar facts, since if she did, she'd risk the people she's trying to turn against trans women and trans femme folk seeing us as actual people. That's why she glosses over the fact that if a trans woman is in a hospital, it's not because she's there to be validated as a woman, it's because she's ill and needs to heal. Something that's hard to do in an environment that is constantly traumatizing her. The same is true of trans women seeking support from domestic violence and rape crisis services. These are people who have been abused, who have been raped, and Duffield has made it her personal goal to cut them off from vital support. And sadly, her tactics are working. Rape Crisis Scotland, one of Scotland's largest services for victims of rape and sexual assault, came under attack by the very people Duffield has aligned herself with. Earlier this year, Edinburgh's Rape Crisis Centre elected an Indian trans woman, Mridul Radva, to the role of CEO. Miss Radva has an impressive CV, having worked at Rape Crisis Scotland, Forth Valley Rape Crisis Centre, and Shakti Women's Aid without incident, and thus seemed like a great candidate. Of course, the bigots began attacking her, both as a trans woman and as a woman of colour, forcing her to lock down her social media. Then, when Rape Crisis Scotland reaffirmed their support of trans women, their channels were flooded with the same sort of abuse Duffield seeks to normalise via her rhetoric, hampering the charity's ability to respond to and support victims of rape and sexual assault. Think about that for a second. The people pretending to care about women's safety made it more difficult for all women who are victims of rape to get essential support in an attempt to permanently exclude trans women from that very same support. This is not about the protection of women, this is about upholding a hateful agenda. As for prisons, the assumption here is that all trans female convicts are violent criminals whilst all cis female convicts aren't. That's not true. Back in 2002, whilst female prisons only accounted for around 6% of the prison population, they accounted for 12% of all sexual assaults that occurred in prisons. Now, this number has since equalized with male prisons, but it notes an important fact. Cis women rape people too. In fact, I was raped as a child inside a domestic violence shelter by one of the cis women using its services. It does happen, but only trans women are being painted as inherently violent here, all whilst Duffield refuses to acknowledge the fact that trans women in male prisons suffer extreme levels of both transphobic and sexual violence. Vicky Thompson was a troubled, working-class woman who had been in and out of care her entire life, failed by the British system, and had already been raped in a male prison once before, only for her to be sent back there over shoplifting charges. And despite of warning both officers and the staff about the violence she was facing, telling them that unless they did something, she would, quote, be carried out in a box, end quote, they did nothing. In spite of another prisoner sliding a note under her door, calling her wifey, telling her that he'd come to rape her, they did nothing. Vicky was found dead on the 13th of November 2015. She'd hung herself, making her the third trans woman to have her life extinguished by the state in this manner in the past 18 months. Another trans woman will be pushed into doing the same thing less than 3 weeks later. Do you know what happened? The UK opened a trans woman only ward in a South London prison, HMP Downview, where they could house trans women, transferring them there for their own safety and the safety of others if need be. Now, I don't personally think trans women should necessarily be isolated unless they have a history of violent crimes, as cis women should also be. But one has to ask, why is Duffield making an issue over this when she's already got what she wants? She's not fighting to keep trans women out of cis women's prisons, she's fighting to force trans women into male prisons as a form of retributive punishment. Not for their crimes, but for what Duffield views as the unforgivable sin of being a trans woman. All of this is nothing more than transmisogyny, that is, the intersection of transphobia and misogyny, a substantial part of which is the framing of all trans women and AMAB trans folk as violent monsters who need to be dealt with. This is why, any time we stand up for ourselves, our rights and our dignity, that is always presented as an act of violence against our oppressors. Just last month, I had a random cis person tag me in a post about another cis person who is also a self-confessed sexual predator, only for the person who tagged me to compare me telling them not to do that, to me hypothetically threatening to murder them. Me setting a basic boundary as a survivor of sexual violence was presented on par with me threatening to murder them. And this is something that's far worse for black trans women and black AMAB trans folk, who not only suffer trans misogyny, but also misogynar, the intersection of anti-black racism and misogyny. White supremacy has historically used gatekeeping regarding gender as a means of promoting and justifying violence against black women, presenting them as loud, aggressive, and manly, and thus an existential threat to white women. That's a big part of the reason why so many of the women accused of being men at the Olympics are black, because their femininity is put under the scrutiny of the white gaze by default. We often talk about the way in which a lot of the talking points Duffield and her peers use are repackaged homophobia, taking cue from the gay predator panic that was used to introduce horrific policies such as Section 28. Yet we also tend to fail to note the fact that a lot of the specific methods used to uphold trans misogyny today were perfected through hundreds of years of anti-black racism, and that black trans women and MB folk are made to suffer both. And a big part of that has been the argument that black women should be excluded from women's safe spaces because it might make racist white women feel uncomfortable. Because when people like Duffield talk about women, they don't actually mean all women. They mean white upper-class able-bodied allo-cishet women, and don't you worry, we will be returning to the class stuff in a minute. But first we have Duffield's question regarding self-ID and whether the majority of women support it. Now, O'Hagan said no, stating that she was talking about respect for trans women in general, which Duffield lied and claimed she agreed with. Spoiler, you can't claim to respect trans women whilst implying they're all predators. But the thing is, the correct answer is yes, at least according to one of the polls I have access to. In a 2020 poll carried out by YouGov, it found that only 21% of women said trans people should not have the right to self-ID, a third less than the 33% of men who said the same. That means Duffield is not supported by the overwhelming majority of women. Hell, she's not even supported by the majority of men. Meanwhile, 57%, a majority, said that trans people should have the right to self-ID, with 22% saying they did not know. However, that's not all we can get from this poll. Oh no. For you see, it gives us the respondent's social grade. Social grading is a system of categorization in the UK in which occupations are divided into 1 of 6 tiers. A and B, which refers to higher and intermediate managerial, administrative, and professional occupations. C1, which refers to supervisory, clerical, and junior managerial, administrative, and professional occupations. C2, which refers to skilled manual occupations. And lastly, D and E, which refer to semi-skilled and unskilled manual occupations, unemployed, and lowest grade occupations. The YouGov poll divided its sample into 2 tiers, A, B, and C1 in the first tier, and C2, D, and E in the second. Now, if what Duffield claimed here were true, we would expect to see a higher percentage of folk in Tier 2 saying that trans people should not have the right to self-ID than those in Tier 1. So what do we actually see? Well, 27% of those in Tier 1 said that trans people should not have the right to self-ID, a number that increases to a whopping, drumroll please, 27% of those in Tier 2. There was no difference between working class and middle to upper class people. In the same way that Rosie Duffield is exploiting the violence inflicted against victims of rape and abuse to further her own political agenda, she's lying about the class differences at play here to try and paint herself as sticking up for the underdog, because that is a massive part of the illusion she is trying to construct. Rosie Duffield does not speak for working class victims of rape and domestic abuse. She certainly does not speak for me. And it's fucking patronizing to see her try to sell the line that transphobia is a feature of the working class. Sadly, the BBC is not about to scrutinize what she says. I mean, they were just outed as promoting a self-confessed serial rapist as an authority on women's safety after launching a thoroughly homophobic attack on Stonewall. So journalistic scrutiny doesn't align with their interest here. But yeah, hopefully this video helps you learn something, and if so, please be sure to leave a like and a comment. I always read every single one and try to respond to as many as possible. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Voorst, Cthulhu, and Flynn. And for myself, Udita, and Levi, take care now.